Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for being here as always. Today we have Richard Parris from Saito, and we're going to be talking about the project. This has been one that's been requested by folks who watch the show. So here we are. We are here to talk about Saito Network. But first, Richard, if you wouldn't mind, please give a quick introduction to the folks watching the show.
Hey, so thanks for having me on. Lovely to be requested. Sign of the kind of growing momentum we have at Saito. My name's Richard, one of the co-founders at Saito, and I think I've been in the Bitcoin then blockchain space since about 2013. Kind of early involved, although Saito is my first kind of major project of any kind in the space. And got involved, back when Bitcoin could be anything. We were all super excited, and I've seen ups and downs and highs and lows since then. And also, I think a theme that we might get back to a few times is sort of saw the first people talking about Web3 in a blockchain context, way back in the early days. And I think that's been a theme through my kind of blockchain experience. And it's also a core of what we're on about at Saito. So I think that's sort of,
Awesome.
really captures the idea for Saito there. Cool.
Yeah, that makes sense. So with regards to Saito, if you could kind of encapsulate the vision and what you've built in sort of the elevator pitch or what the project is all about, what would you share with people?
So I think it continues on from what I was just saying, which was, first time I saw Bitcoin, I was like, wow, this could be anything. And the first couple of things I did were, play with Satoshi's dice, put graffiti on the wall, that kind of stuff. And it was all database. It wasn't necessarily money, although that was obviously having micropayments there was something. And, we kind of lost that along the way. The parody guys, Gavin Wood, have like vivified the Web3 idea, given it life again. But that's something we've always really stuck to at Saito. And we've come from that Bitcoin background, UTXO, simple blockchain. But the core of Saito is an insight that the first thing you've got to do when you want scale is to pay for it. And that proof of work and proof of stake are inevitably, in their designs, going to struggle with paying for scale because by design they only pay for routing and staking. So at best, any payments that go to network providers, the peer-to-peer network, are secondary, right? They're going to be, miners don't want to lose their network. They'll pay for routing equipment or they'll pay for nodes that will hold the entire blockchain. Unfortunately, what we've seen in every other scenario, that's not how it works in economics. And what Saito does is it grapples with that problem head on and says, we need to start with a blockchain that can pay the peer-to-peer network. And that's what we do. And that gives us a really scalable, open platform for essentially PKI, public key infrastructure for Web3. And there's lots of ways that interacts in the ecosystem and can kind of interact and work with other chains. But that's really what we're about, is providing public key cryptography to everyone in a way that makes Web3 possible that isn't now.
Got it. And so when you look at how Saito Network approaches this sort of the ecosystem standards now, looking at things like tokenization, and then the things that come from that, you're looking at DeFi, and then of course NFTs and sort of these applications that have been built on these foundations. What is Saito's posture around that? Like, how does it facilitate a fruitful DApp ecosystem?
Right. I think the thing to look at there is, Saito in itself, on the face of it, is a criticism of proof of work and proof of stake. It's saying there's an issue there. You need a volunteer in both of those networks to run the network. But Saito at the same time doesn't have an EVM inbuilt, and that's by design. That's not what it's doing. So in terms of tokenization things, if we just take a really good example that people understand, that's right there every day for us, say Uniswap. Now, if you look at Uniswap, theoretically it's open source, and I mean, it really is open source. You can go and get the source code. They're not lying about that. It's just right there. But realistically, if I'm using Uniswap and I got a bunch of money on there, and the Uniswap team take everything down, okay, the smart contract's still there on Ethereum, and you and I could like spin up a server, put the source code on, spin it up, tell our wallets that it's really, really is Uniswap, and you can really believe that. And then we might be able to construct transactions that will hit the smart contract and move our money around again. So we might be able to get the liquidity back and start moving our tokens about. But there's a hell of a lot of trust there and a hell of a lot of reliance on these third parties, which is essentially really what Web3 is supposed to not have. And so where Saito can come in there is it says, well, we've done most of the disintermediation, most of the decentralization that people are looking for, but we've still got these core pieces, right? And the point is that there isn't a genuine alternative for something as big as Uniswap to run on an open PKI network. You can't run the applications themselves in Ethereum. And you couldn't have wallets with the code in them that just hit Ethereum, because then there'd be no Infura. And realistically, Uniswap's hitting somebody else's server that contains a record of the whole Ethereum chain, a nice API endpoint for your Trust wallet or your Ledger or whatever to hit. It's not going directly off the chain. The app in your phone can't do that. What Saito lets you do is, so actually we could build something where you have a light node in your phone, and it is receiving at least partial block data, like Merkleized block data, if you know what that is, but a provable part of the blockchain, but with just the information you need. And you can share that around, and the chain is going to scale to provide you that data, because the way you're profitable in Saito is to provide network access to users, i.e. get their transactions from their wallets onto the network. That's the most profitable thing you can do. So instead of mining and staking, generating all this pool of money or this infrastructure that isn't doing anything for the network, Saito pulls that money into services for users. So what we would hope is that things like Uniswap, but then also say NFT galleries, anything like that, would be able to be built as a peer-to-peer, pure peer-to-peer application that accesses the Saito blockchain for its infrastructure and might use any third-party chain for its value flow or for the tokens, fungible or otherwise, that get moved around. So that's kind of where we fit in. I'm not sure if that's sometimes a little wandering off into the kind of a little bit abstract, but hopefully that gets people excited about where we can fit in and what we can do for the ecosystem and Web3.
Yeah, I think it is an area that I think a lot of people don't think about, and that is that while a foundational idea of a Web3 application or a decentralized application in general is that you start to unify your account, it becomes your wallet, and you can interact with a decentralized service where the business logic lives in a smart contract on a blockchain. You're not interacting with a bank or what have you, insert intermediary here. The trick is the interface that you're interacting with that application with, and a lot of the functional layers above that smart contract are still owned by a third party, just inherently.
Right. Well, I think it's the thing. Like, if you want to tell your grandma or a random other relative, I don't want to impugn grandmas, about explain the difference between Web 2 and Web 3. It's quite easy. You just say, look, the first thing that happens in Web 2 is you give someone your identity and they keep it. So you create a username and password, you give them, they hold your identity. It's really obvious when you look at it that way. And you can tell a Web 3 interaction or a wannabe Web 3 interaction because you don't do that. You use your key and you retain the rights to that and the ability to, give it access or something might be elsewhere, but you are autonomous in your decision to give away that key and you retain the signing rights. And so it feels like, well, if you solve that problem, if you move from one to the other, you've got Web3, but you don't quite yet. And that's it's actually that last mile that's harder. Mm-hmm. And it comes down to, well, are you genuinely building peer-to-peer things? If you have a data service provider, and so we're not against having a provider that would house, they could be an Arweave type scenario or Filecoin, but it could also just be a far more traditional looking data warehouse that stores your stuff. But to be Web3, you have to have this sort of situation pertaining where, people are using their keys and they're encrypting their data. So the provider can't tell what the user's doing even. They can't tell the difference between storing their data and reading it and accessing it or moving it off to another provider. Right? Mm-hmm. So that way you can't have lock-in. If the provider can tell if you're trying to get rid of your, shift your data somewhere else, then they've got some kind of hold over you. And that's really what you need to avoid, not because people with data servers are bad, but because that's a Web 2 model, right? They're then in a competitive space where they have an option to monetize you some other way, and they're competing against people who will. So they have to.
Yeah.
And you go back to what we have now, where you are the product, and everybody's in a race to the bottom in terms of like, well, we say we don't want to be evil, but we've got to make some money, and our competitors will if we don't. So you've kind of got this real slippery slope situation where you've got to do is say, no, we're genuinely P2P. And my interaction with the data server is the same with any provider. If I have someone archiving my transactions, there's nothing wrong with that. But I want to make sure that I encrypted them and they don't even have enough metadata to tell what's in there, so that I can actually have two providers doing that, and I can end a contract with one and go to another without them really knowing that I was going to do that. And that'll take a bit of doing, but that's only possible if you have enough capacity on chain to do that, and you need to bring that to people. You need to bring enough of that to people to really support these bigger systems. And I think what we see is a lot of singular problems being solved at the moment without something that can comprehensively handle the load to kind of be the backbone for this.
So do you see Saito being if you look at the future Web3 stack, if you will, you might have the layer zeros, you're talking like the Polkadots of the world that might connect several heterogeneous layer 1 blockchains together. And then you have those layer 1s. And then on top of that, you might have Saito that is sort of an application layer construct for these. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is where we go with our dimensions, because it's sort of next to or under.
Yeah, it's tough to even stack them.
Yeah, we've already said Polkadot's under, so where do we live? I mean, Polkadot's a brilliant example of why Saito's needed. So I've dealt a lot with the Polkadot ecosystem, and we've got some really, strong partners there, and we've got a lot of, sort of history. We got a Web3 grant where we open sourced some gaming stuff we had and shared that with the community. But talking to people as the parachain auctions are coming up and moving along, what you're seeing is a lot of ETH developers who may have gone off and tried EOS or something else because they were looking for that capacity. They bounced around. They've come to the Polkadot ecosystem because of the really strong tooling and things around the parachains and what the kind of relay chain parachain model can do for them. Then they want to start building apps, and you can literally see them reach back for Infura. Mm-hmm. Right? Where's the API endpoint for my users' apps? Mm-hmm. And you can tell that people saw this coming because there's really good software, really nicely written software that clearly has seen things like Etherscan and understood the challenge, and it's really well-written software. But there's no Infura running it. So all the projects are suddenly saying, well, actually, I need to run that all myself. Yeah. Right, to make this possible. And they're starting to say, you hear this collective gulp from the developers and the DevOps people, that how are we going to do that? And I think that really illustrates the issue that we're trying to take on there. It's not contrary to what Polkadot are trying to do, but it's saying there's still this piece in there where the network doesn't have a Web3 way of scaling up with the data flows. And the perfect partner is a transactional blockchain that lets you do all the heavy lifting and keeps the value transactions and things on your chain that need to be on your chain to the precise minimum that they need to be. So you're both saving costs, you're lowering gas fees, you're doing all of those things for your users. And you're preventing yourself from needing to say, well, we're going to be all nice and open up here, but down here we're going to have a lock-in layer of some kind that you're just going to have to tolerate. And so that's kind of how I see ourselves fitting in. And Polkadot's a good example because it's kind of ETH can be like monolithic looking and harder to see where the connection is, whereas Polkadot's got that kind of interesting separation already.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting the dynamic there, the way you describe it. And when I initially started reading about Saito, that was sort of my what I gathered as well. That rather than, and this is different than a lot of different projects, but it's not a hyper competitive approach. It's a how can we be complementary and provide a necessary tool, being very problem focused in this space in general, which I
Yeah.
think is interesting.
Yeah, I think there'll be some contention,
Hmm.
but that's important because it's a kind of if you're designing your own little ecosystem, say a corporate network or something, you have questions when you're doing the architecture. Does this task belong here or here? Right. So there are some things that I think in blockchain are just being done in the wrong place right now because they're being done in a way that's expensive, et cetera. But hey, we're just getting started. So I don't think that's problematic. I think that should shake out, right? And that Sato's stance there is always, well, we'll see where the economics takes us and where design gets us to. So there may be some redesigning of things as we move up and can take on more transactional data. But if you think about it as like a question of what should be on chain and what shouldn't be on chain, there's like some stuff that's obviously going to jam up blockchains full of dust and junk data very quickly. There's a high value things where you can say, well, I can see a very good reason to have that on chain. And then there's probably things in the middle where you're like, well, we've got various options to design this. We do we want the full ledger of the chain? Do we want, the extra work of rewriting that history harder? Or can we rely on the cryptographic signatures that we have in all of the transactions anyway to verify things? And what's the right balance? Because it comes down to cost. Right. And so in the end, what we'll need to do is look at what users are getting out of the system and say, well, do they want to pay for that? Right. And is there a value for them there? And when there is, that's great. When there isn't, we've frankly designed something that's just expensive. And let's stop doing that. And, the more we can improve in that way, the more uptake we'll get generally, the more that blockchain solutions will become desirable generally because they're better on all fronts, and the less people will look at it and say, well, it's interesting tech, but do we really need the blockchain, etc.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting philosophical puzzle in a sense, and also something that developers in this space go through all the time. This idea of how much can we put on chain? You start in one spot and you start to say, okay, what we need to lop off one side that just should categorically not be there for performance reasons, or for security reasons, or for
Yeah.
cost. And then it's optimizations, giving up small pieces or whatever to make sure that your
Right.
app is cheap enough for people to use and all that.
Yeah.
Um, it's
Yeah, I think
interesting stuff.
that's something where we're also like really kind of I think that the space can skewer itself though on that optimization philosophy at times because it's assumed developers often assume, well, there's the software trilemma, so there must be a scalability trilemma, which is something that at Saito we don't actually think is the case. But so there's a kind of problem in the industry that often we see problems as technical. And it's just a dev heavy space. So developers, of course, like to hear that, and we like to tell ourselves that. I'm one as well. But actually, sometimes it's the design at the basics that you need to rethink what you're doing. And there is a way out of that puzzle, but it's not a development optimization thing. And so what we're striving to do is find out like where that is. And for us, we've said that scaling and scalability is not one of those cases where you have to optimize around proof of work and proof of stake. You can pay for scale. And when you do that, you get scale at a much higher level. Of course, no matter how much scale you have, optimization makes sense. So it's not like there won't be any optimization. We do whatever we like. Profligate data use makes sense. But I think we do need to check ourselves and say, is this an optimization problem or is it a design problem in the sort of a fundamental design problem? And Saito's really taken a step back and looked at scaling and said, well, the first question is if you're going to have a worldwide network that handles terabytes a day or more, petabytes a day at some point, that's going to run in data centers and it's going to be expensive. So we can forget that if we can't pay for it. If all the money is going to miners and stakers, you can forget that kind of scale. It's not going to happen. So solve that problem first, then you can get on to the question of how do I optimize for data. And the Saito solution invariably when we do need to optimize like that is to say, well, it should be a market. If we can make it a market that's a functioning market without obviously markets can have pretty big flaws, then you can get price discovery and you can find out what people want to pay. So we do that, for instance, with chain data. We don't keep all of it. Data has to pay to stay on chain. So we have a sort of circling blockchain. And when a new block is created, old data needs to decide whether the fee is worth it to stay on chain. So we've now got a market price for chain data. That's very different to saying, oh, well, we'll need to, lick our fingers, stick it in the air and say, I think it should cost this. Right. And then hoping that permanent ledger survives despite the fact that it's priced on kind of, guesswork. So we're trying to set kind of some new standards as well when we do those sorts of things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, so for someone who's looking at this, I mean, there are obviously various varying perspectives. There's the builder's perspective, there's the investor, and then there's the sort of casual researcher. Where can folks go to learn more about Saito and to kind of put those pieces together, even after they watch this video?
Cool. So this is something we're kind of aware of and we're working on a lot. So there'll be a bit of change over the next while. I don't want to say anything in the video that's going to then be outdated because we've moved forward. But Saito.io will always be the good starting point. We've got a lot of things happening on our wiki that will be opening up soon that should have kind of condensed all of this. There's also a few things. Maybe I can drop them in a comment on the video. I'll share them with you.
Yeah, sure.
We've actually had some amazing stuff done by community who just looped together some really solid lists. A guy called 0x Luminous has an amazing GitHub repository, which just has a file with links to all the major stuff that he keeps pretty updated. And at the moment, that's actually a really good resource. The other thing is hopping into the Telegram announcements channel where you can get like a fairly good stream of things like this. You can see what's coming up and get the latest. We also do regular town halls and things like that. So that's a great place to find out where you can get some kind of various media, AMAs, interviews, that sort of thing. But always Saito.io is a good place to start because that has the socials, etc., and you can find your way from there.
Fantastic. So folks, you know what to do. We'll have a pinned comment down there. I'll just go ahead and pin Richard's comment. It might be from the Saito account, might be from Richard's personal account. We'll see what happens. Richard, yeah, you never know. Definitely, I want to thank you for taking the time to join and talk about Saito, and I'm sure we'll do another session here in the future as things develop.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's been a good long session, and I don't want to go on, but I feel like we've just started touching on stuff. So I'd love to come back at some point, maybe with updates and answer some questions, those sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. We can do maybe an AMA or something like that, or like a town hall
That'd be cool.
thing here. Great.
That'd be great.
Great.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for your time. And thank you everyone who's watching this sort of introduction to Saito. Really appreciate it. If you have some time, make sure you stick around for another video, which I'll link here. But until next time, cheers.